Okay, we're going to be in section 3 of chapter 15. We're going to examine the rise of the samurai, discuss the samurai lifestyle, and analyze disorder and new government in Japan. So, with the emperor distracted by life in court, where we talked the last section about how the emperor was standing in court, not like court that we have today, but the court where a lot of royal, fancy people was hanging out, and they would just sit around talking about art and stuff, and didn't really worry about the everyday people. So because of that, the daimyo, or the landowners, decided they needed to protect their land. They hired samurai, or trained professional warriors, to defend their property. And the samurai wore light armor and fought with swords and bows. They mostly came from noble families and inherited the positions from their fathers. So the samurai were basically hired soldiers. This is the same thing when we talk about feudalism here in a couple of chapters. It's going to be the same concept as lords and vassals and things like that, except you have the daimyo that are the landowners that hire the samurai. They give them food, they give them land in order to fight and protect their area. The word samurai comes from the Japanese word for servant, and an army of samurai were very expensive. Few lords could actually pay for them with money, so they get them land and food instead. Now, the best samurai would get land. The ones that were not as good, they would usually get food, usually rice. The best samurai would get land, and they would use that land basically to hire people to farm it for them. And they'd make money off of it. They'd actually live there. Many of the nobles outside of Heian were unhappy with the way Japan's government was being ran. Two powerful clans went to war with each other in the 1150s, and they fought for almost 30 years. In the end, the Minamoto clan won, and the leader took over as the most powerful man in Japan. This is going to lead to the rise of the shoguns. He kept the emperor on as a figurehead, or someone who appears the role, even though the real power rests with someone else. As a samurai, the Minamoto leader was supposed to be loyal to the emperor, but instead he decided to rule in the emperor's place. In 1192, he took the title of shogun, who was a general that ruled Japan in the emperor's name. So the emperor stayed on as a figurehead, but he really had no power. He was mostly there just to give authority to the shogun. And so the idea was they're supposed to be loyal to the emperor, but really they were the ones pulling the strings the whole time. Under the shogun, samurai warriors became more central to Japanese society. The samurai were given special treatment. They had to be treated with respect, and anyone that disrespected a samurai could be killed. It was an honorable thing. It was something that you respected them and you honored them. Samurai could also not take part in certain things, such as theater or engaging in trade, which seemed beneath them. It was something that wasn't on the level they were supposed to be. And so because that was beneath them, and they were supposed to stay away from that. Most importantly, all samurai had to follow a strict code of rules. This was called Bushido. Now, I've got a video from The Last Samurai, the movie's got Tom Cruise in it, that discusses Bushido and kind of goes over that a little bit. But Bushido was the samurai code of laws. It's going to be basically what chivalry is for the knights. It required samurai to be brave and honorable fighters. Samurai were expected to live simple lives and believed that self-discipline made them better warriors. Samurai, above all, were expected to be loyal to their lord. They had to obey their master's orders without hesitation, even if it caused the samurai and their family to suffer. So basically, if the person that hired them, and the people that were over them, if they said do this and they didn't, then they would be punished, even if it meant bringing their family suffering. If a samurai lost their honor, they were required to take their own lives. And this is one of the most well-known things about Bushido, is that they were required to basically stab themselves with their own sword and take their own lives. Sometimes, depending on how dishonorable they were seen as being, they would have to put the sword inside of them and then move it around, cutting up their insides. It's very gruesome, but that was how they had to do it. They would have to cut their insides and they would die. Now, if you were honorable and you made a mistake and you had to die by Bushido, then there would be someone standing there with swords at your neck, and as soon as you stabbed yourself, they would cut your head off. And again, I'm not trying to be graphic, but this is how they did it, as a way of letting you die quickly, so it wasn't a suffering death. Now, if they felt like you deserved to suffer, they would make you cover your insides by moving your sword around, and then you would just basically sit there and bleed out. And so it's very, very strict, very intense. It's something that it wasn't taken lightly. There wasn't, today there's a lot of disrespect, a lot of dishonorable people. If it would happen in those days, those people had to take their own life, and it's very intense. Although it was created as a code for warriors, Bushido influenced most of the Japanese society. Even today, the samurai's depiction and our dedication and discipline are still greatly admired in Japan. Some of the central ideas of the samurai code, such as loyalty and honor, are still very important in modern Japan. And we'll talk a little bit more about Bushido when we get into the chapter. I believe it's 17, but it might be 19, where we talk about feudalism and the lords, the vassals, and things like that. We'll compare them then. For about a century, the shoguns kept order in Japan. Serious challenges arose that brought an end to this order. One of those great thefts was the Mongol invasion of 1274. The first invasion, the Japanese were helped by a great storm that helped force the Mongols to flee. The second invasion was a harder fought battle, but again, a storm helped the Japanese. And the second invasion left the nobles unhappy with the war because they felt the shogun didn't give them enough credit, leading to resentment. So you're going to start having where the Mongols, remember we talked about with the Chinese history chapter that the Mongols invaded all of China and they got to Japan and couldn't invade Japan. This is where we're at. After the Mongol invasion, the emperor began fighting the shogun for control of the country. During this power struggle, small wars broke out all over Japan. And by the 1400s, the shoguns had lost most all of their authority, and the emperor was still largely powerless. The daimyo instead controlled their territory, but there was no central power in Japan. So it's a period kind of like the Warring States period in China, where there's no strong central government. It's just a bunch of different random people fighting each other. In the 1500s, leaders fought again to unify Japan under one control. Oda Nobunaga was the first leader to do this and gave his supporters guns that were brought from Portugal. When Oda Nobunaga died, other rulers gained power. And so you're going to, again, have this power struggle of leaders and nobles and stuff like that coming and fighting, and Japan having to either unite or stay divided. And that's kind of what's going on here. By 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu conquered his enemies and was made shogun by the emperor. From his capital of Edo, he ruled over all of Japan. His rise to power led to the Tokugawa shogunate, ruled by the Tokugawa family. And so it unified in the 1600s, giving the Tokugawa shogunate the control over Japan. Some feared that if Japanese became too powerful like Europe, that the shoguns would lose their power. And in the 1630s, the ruling shogun cut Japan off from the rest of the world. The Japanese rulers also banned guns, and the shogun period lasted on into the 1800s. And so, basically, it's similar to what with China. They decided they didn't want to be influenced by the outside world. They didn't want to get too powerful, because then the people would take over and not want the shoguns to have control. And of course, the shoguns don't have control now. And so in the 1600s, they cut off the relationships with the rest of the world, and that would last until about the 1800s. They also banned guns, and the shogun period lasts until the 1800s. And so that's going to be the end of the chapter on Japanese history. Of course, there's so much more than Japanese history. We just barely scratched the surface. I usually don't even get to teach this chapter, but I got to this year. So we will move on to the next chapter and the next 9 weeks.